Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host, and today we have the great pleasure of talking to David Dixon, who is the Urban Planning Fellow at Stantec. David has worked on many fascinating projects over the years, including the post-Katrina New Orleans master plan. I believe I have that correct.
Yes.
And I know he's done a lot of work here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, including the Kendall Square plan, which really laid out the foundation for one of the most important innovation ecosystems in the world, you could even say. I want to welcome you all to Unplanned and remind you to subscribe. We'll have lots of more interesting conversations to come. But let's now talk to David. David, I want to welcome you to Unplanned and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for the invitation and for the very kind, if not overly kind, introduction. So thank you.
David, you've done a lot of fascinating stuff over the years, and you've had a lot of opportunity to think about cities and how they work. And now we're in this incredible COVID moment.
Yes.
Before we get too far down the road, why don't you tell us just a little bit more about yourself? It's always interesting to hear from the person who they are.
Okay, thank you. I love cities. How's that? I've always loved cities. I've actually had the good fortune to have a career at a time when demographics and our economy and changing technology have kind of lined up behind me. So a world that, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, I was kind of discouraged about because the only place worth investing was the suburbs and that kind of thing, has turned around and it gave me a pretty rewarding career. I've had a chance to work on a lot of terrific projects. They were kind of delivered to me by the circumstances in which I live.
Let's jump right into the COVID stuff.
Sure.
I know it's impacting everybody. It's impacting all of us.
Yeah.
You are a planner who thinks both about the planning world and about the urban physical world and how we live together. What are some of the big picture things you've seen and noticed over the course of the last 2 months?
Well, it's interesting. I was just asked to talk about what lessons one would learn from the New Orleans experience, which was just a catastrophe and a terrible tragedy for an entire city and region for more than 1 million people. So in some ways, it's a microcosm of what we're going through now. People weren't forced to stay at home. They literally had to leave their homes, and in many cases, their homes left them. When I had a chance both to be involved in recovery planning and then the great honor and privilege of working with those terrific folks on their master plan. The most important lessons that I took from that, and it's a lens through which I certainly have looked at COVID and looked there we're now, is that the fundamental forces, dynamics, trends at work in New Orleans before Katrina were what really mattered in coming out of Katrina. New Orleanians had a great deal of courage and real grit. They basically said, don't rebuild, rebuild better. And what that came quickly to mean to me is we didn't have a 21st century economy. We had serious race problems. We had a widening income divide. That might sound familiar. We're on the front line of climate change. Those issues were what mattered coming out of Katrina. Rebuilding from Katrina was the tool for dealing with those more fundamental issues. Is this making sense?
It is making sense.
And COVID is presenting us in many ways with that obligation, maybe more than opportunity.
Were you able to, given that as your criteria for New Orleans, how successful was the effort? We're now 15 years later. If that's a dry run for COVID, it'd be interesting to know, how have we done overall?
We have done about as well as any big complicated city might do, but no, I think New Orleans has actually done, I'd say New Orleans is a much better place today. And I would imagine many New Orleanians, I doubt any of them would basically have cast the deal with the devil that said, give us Katrina to get here. But New Orleans is now a city with a 21st century economy. That means it has it is still a city with a great deal of poverty, but it has resources to deal with that poverty. It has traded a world in which, frankly, a lot of folks dropped out of high school, lived in public housing, and worked in low-wage service jobs for a world in which public housing has been redeveloped as mixed income housing. There's a real focus on education. There is a real drive to be more than a port and a tourism economy, but to be a place where entrepreneurs and others can succeed and create jobs for other folks. It is a place that has managed to hold on to its culture, and its culture is maybe not I don't know if glitz is the right term or whatever that we see. It is a culture that really grew up in Black New Orleans, that came from West Africa and was nurtured in neighborhoods and passed on from generation to generation, and is now celebrated across that city. It has managed to hold on to this as it has sort of changed and matured. When I first arrived in New Orleans, folks used to say, we're the northernmost Caribbean city. That's not actually such a great thing to be, much as I love the Caribbean. I would say New Orleans is now a city that is finding ways to succeed, challenged by COVID, like many American cities. Is that getting
Yeah,
your question?
no, absolutely. Let me ask you about this. There's so much in there. And I listened to a podcast, actually, I think it was a WBUR one, where they had Ken Greenberg on.
Yeah.
And his great thesis is that COVID really is a dry run for climate change.
So first, at one level, I would agree, and I understand the logic. When I first heard, I remember sitting and having breakfast. I've long cared about density, and I and two co-conspirators were planning yet another density conference. And we heard about this storm coming to New Orleans, and one colleague said, it's a bowl, and we both gasped because we realized the horrible flooding implications. So if ever there were a city that is not prepared for sea level rise and the implications of climate change, it is New Orleans. The Dutch came to New Orleans when I was working there and brought a wonderful perspective. They said basically after World War II, they had to really repair the damage to their sea defenses. The North Sea is a ferocious neighbor. And they developed the sort of meme, a guilder spent on what we call resilience or on defense, it should be a guilder spent on quality of life, meaning use the fact that we have to invest in New Orleans to protect ourselves to create a better, more livable city. Those are going to be dollars we can do, they can provide, they can serve multiple tasks. And that to me is actually how we should look at our response to climate change.
Part of my interest in talking to you is that you have been very vocal, and I gather over the years, very vocal about density. And
Yes.
there is a debate about density. The question is perhaps what role does it play in our future? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I suspect you have some thoughts and opinions about that. I'm curious if you can share some of those.
Oh dear, time's up. No, I actually, as a matter of fact, I do. So first of all, I want to put this in a very pragmatic light. Before COVID struck, we already knew that over the next 20 years, more than 80% of net new households, that is our housing market, are going to be singles and couples without kids. These are folks who have always and will prefer urban living. This is 80+% of our housing economy. They're basically going to be chasing about 30% of our housing supply. We live in a country with a growing shortage of labor at the same time that 90+% of all net new jobs require some higher education, and a good majority of those 4 years or more. Majority of factory jobs require at least 2 years of higher education and increasingly 4, et cetera. These are folks who, even more than everybody else, have historically, and I cannot imagine why this would change, preferred urban living. What has discouraged them from living in cities is the cost of urban housing, because we've had a real shortage in all of our successful cities. Job growth has far outstripped housing.
But let me ask you this. I believe, and this may be an example that you shared with me, but post 9/11,
yes,
there was an article with a rather compelling title that I think in Wired magazine that said density kills. That was
Yes.
the comment about 9/11 and flying planes into buildings. Some people are making
Yeah.
a similar argument today,
Yes.
that actually what we need to do is spread out and move,
Yeah.
create that greater distance.
Well, first of all, there was probably much more palpable fear of density after 9/11. It's interesting that most of us, including me, have a hard time tapping into that, but I now remember. That article and a whole series of articles said we will never build any more urban towers, et cetera. We won't be able to get insurance for them, things like that. Long story short, first of all, the deadliest thing that we can do is spread out, because the um, good public health data and longer lifespans correlate with two things: income and walkability. Income is a tough thing to help a lot of folks with these days, but walkability isn't. Walkability is a matter of not having to depend on a car. It is literally, if you don't depend on a car, you walk more. If you walk more, you live longer and you have better health data. Far more people died because they were, I'll call it marooned, that's an awful term, a lot of judgment there, in a completely auto-dependent lifestyle than will die from COVID. I understand that's not a fair comparison at all. And probably even in roughly the same period. To be more pragmatic about it, what I began to notice, and this was in the early 2000s, is a lot of folks who are making urban decisions to live an urban lifestyle were basing that partly on their understanding of public health. Around that it was more sustainable and provided a healthier lifestyle than a greener environment. I think that same information, that same data is going to come roaring back when a vaccine is in place. I am fully confident that density will be in demand, but density is also what delivers the kind of value, the ability to grow a knowledge economy, the ability to support lively public parks, and all the kinds of things that we value as a society today. We can't do these things without density.
You made a very interesting observation to me, which is that if you go out 30 years or 40 years, there's some speculation that every federal discretionary dollar will be spent on healthcare, basically.
Oh, thank you for mentioning it. Yes.
And that means that the capacity of the federal government to do anything significant will be severely curtailed, which means that localities have to do that much more. Can you flesh out this idea? It's a very thoughtful and provocative thought.
So right now, more than half our population growth the next 20 years is going to be folks like me, over 65. And to be a little bit direct, we get expensive because we have much higher health costs, and we live in a society where we take collective responsibility for that. So there are a number of projections that point out that the federal government, it's hard to imagine the federal government having any discretionary dollars left after it takes care of the healthcare costs of a much older population by 2050, and probably by 30 and 40 we'll really be feeling this. So fewer federal resources. At the same time, to come back to Ken Greenberg's point, it's going to be very expensive to deal incrementally or not with climate change. We also, one glaring lesson from our horrible COVID and very tragic COVID experience has been the inequity with which it has been experienced or inflicted on us. To come back to density, for you and I were talking about the fact that I look further into this. COVID just correlates far more closely with household income and race than it does with density, much more closely. And even in New York, the densest parts of New York are by no means the areas that they're suffering no more than many rural areas. It is the poor parts of Bronx and Queens, et cetera. So anyway, we're going to need to find a lot of money to deal with growing income divide, which is part of having a knowledge industry economy, with an aging society, and with climate change. The place we're going to be able to really create value is in our dense, active, vibrant, knowledge industry rich downtowns. We at a local and regional level are going to have to really create value and wealth. We're not going to be able to depend on our traditional source. And that's clearly a projection on my part, but I think it's an informed one.
But it's a great observation, it seems to me. But the question that I think it raises is, if creating value happens at the local level, that also presumably means that the local level becomes more expensive. That the way you And then if you garner some of that money through taxation or other means, the higher the value, the more public dollars you have. But that also forces people out of communities, and it changes the nature of communities.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you think about that, given everything we've seen through COVID?
Depressingly, no. It's going to be really important we have to tap that wealth. If we don't tap that wealth to pay for any of these needs, it won't do us much good as a society, and politically we may not choose to let it happen, to be direct. And I realize also I'm sort of stating this in blacker and whiter terms than it's going to work out, but I'm talking about vectors, directions. So it's going to be critical. There is no way we'll ever build enough housing to build our way into affordability. We have to subsidize our way to affordability. If you think about it, everything that Cambridge, liberal Boston right next door where I live, liberal New York, liberal Austin, Texas, all Seattle have all become much more expensive because in order to attract the knowledge economy, they had to be more walkable, more cool, more amenitized, more desirable to people with incomes and with education, therefore incomes. There is no way out of the sort of the dynamic of having to make yourself more expensive. What we have to do is invest, is tap that wealth we're creating and invest it in equity. And it's not just housing, it's job training, workforce readiness. Yeah.
So I want to thank you. I want to get us towards the closing out because we only have a certain number of minutes in this program, unfortunately. Let me start by just thanking you for spending some time. Your work, two closing questions. One is you have worked on and are working on many interesting projects. Tell us about one, either present or past or potentially future, that is just has kind of got your interest. We're always fascinated by those. And then we're also curious about a sort of personal observation about COVID in these last couple of months. It's been a fascinating time for us all, and curious what your perspective is. But first, give us a thought about something that's interesting, either you're working on or have worked on, that we'd be interested in.
Sort of like asking one to choose between their babies, but I think the projects that most fascinate me are the ones that unlock the ability of communities to provide better lives for folks, and so to make that more tangible. We recently worked on a charrette with the good folks of Buffalo and the Congressman of Urbanism about how to become more competitive around innovative mobility to attract knowledge industry to Buffalo, talent and knowledge industry to Buffalo. The point here, creating an economy that can then help Buffalo solve problems, very real problems that a lot of folks have that they simply can't without those resources. In a similar sense, I am fascinated by the fact that I grew up in a world where rich folks didn't want to live near poor folks, et cetera. Well, it turns out now that diversity is a plus in the marketplace for many of us, which means we really can redevelop our public housing into mixed income housing. I had a chance to work on a project in Charlestown. It's stalled for other reasons right now to turn 1,100 units of public housing into 2,700 units of mixed income housing, and that will work today. And not only that, the market rate housing will pay for much better housing for the folks who live in public housing, and there are all kinds of opportunities to get job training, all kinds of things as part of it. Those are the kinds of projects that get me excited. We're doing a downtown master plan for Memphis. Memphis is a region also that really needs to reach out and grab hold of the knowledge economy to create the resources that it needs, and it will do this like same thing in Buffalo by becoming just a cooler place, a place people want to be, a place that really celebrates its culture and can translate its amenity into attracting talent that then can attract investments and resources.
Yeah, all of those are absolutely fascinating, and I thank you for sharing them. The housing one I find is particularly interesting. The challenges of housing.
HUD is also running out of. HUD is running out of money to support public housing, and we have to shift to that solution. And luckily, it's there to shift to.
Yeah. Now, for one, just a more personal observation, your experience of COVID the last couple of months, what's it been like from where you are?
Oh, wow. Well, it's a very personal experience. I have 2 grandkids. Because I have 2 son and daughter-in-law who both have jobs, and 4 of us have an easier time caring for 2 young kids than 2. We've all rented a house together, and I am watching my 2 grandchildren, 6 and 2, learn to be friends and brothers and having an experience I never would have been able to have if this hadn't happened. And there's a great deal of tragedy associated with it, and I understand, and this is maybe a shared luxury on my part, but the chance to sort of share this time with these kids has been magic and wonderful. And, you know, I go up and work all day, but I get to come down and do it at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and after dinner. So
yeah, it's fascinating and wonderful. I mean, yes, these are tragic times, and there's been a lot of pain and suffering and death. But it's also given us all the chance to have a minute, which is great.
I also really appreciated your perspective that what if we woke up and I've forgotten how you put it, but we had to start the city over again.
Well, my phrasing of it is COVID gave us the opportunity to run the experiment we never thought we'd be able to.
Yeah.
What if we shut down the city for a day?
That is fascinating. And one of the things that I'm excited about is the tragedy of so many folks losing their businesses will be an entrepreneurial opportunity for a whole new generation of folks. This sounds very sad and cruel in many ways, but there's going to be a lot that is very exciting that will happen in our cities, sadly or not, because of COVID, because the losses are going to create opportunities for folks with new skills and new interests and new ways to make our lives exciting.
David, I want to say what a pleasure it is to talk to you as always, and how much fun and how interesting it is. And I want to thank you for joining us on Unplanned.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate the fact you're doing this, and great questions. So thank you.